Welcome to the podcast about Tatars in Poland. I am Maurits Berger, Professor of Islam in the West at Leiden University in the Netherlands.
And I am Ewa Górska, an assistant professor at the Digital Justice Center at the University of Wrocław in Poland. Together we'll explore the history, identity and traditions of the Tatars, the Muslim minority that has lived in Poland for around 600 years. Our quest will take us to remote parts of Poland, but also into libraries and into meetings with Tatars from all walks of life.
Our question is, who are the Tatars in Poland and how do they carve out their lives in Polish society? And is Islam here in Poland different from somewhere else? These are more than academic questions. They are also questions about the ways that Muslims are part of Europe. Hi Eva, how are you?
Hi Maurits, I'm good. How are you? It's been a long time.
Yes, quite a while. I think it's like 2 years. 2 years since we made that road trip together in March 2023. And since then we have done some extra online interviews. We've been working hard on making the podcast, which was actually more work than I anticipated. But I must say it has also given us time, or it has given me time to reflect on everything that we heard and that we learned.
Yeah, same for me. And, the world has changed quite a bit since we recorded this. So I'm actually very much curious to hear what are your thoughts right now about our trip, about the podcast. Was it what you expected?
Not really. But I mean that in a positive way. Before we went out for that trip, I'd done a lot of reading, and I'd created this image of, some community, Tatars in Poland, living an Islamic life. But it was, of course, much more complex than that. Very entangled with Polish culture and history, of which I did not know much. But it showed me the richness of Islam in Europe. And also, the proof that Islam is much deeper embedded in European society and history than is often assumed. Islam in Europe is usually seen as the Muslims in Western Europe who have arrived in the second half of the last century, but there are also large and diverse communities who are indigenous to Europe, like we've seen in the Balkan countries, but also in Poland and the Baltic states. And I must also confess that I discovered to my shame that I'm a typical Western European-centered person. Remember when we were in the mosque, all the way in Podlasie in eastern Poland, near the border of Belarus, and that I experienced that as being the most eastern fringe of Europe. Well, for the Muslim Tatars there, it is of course the center of their world.
Yeah, and, funny you should say that, because really it's not even the easternmost edge of Europe, just the eastern edge of European Union. But for me, it actually highlights how all of us unconsciously simplify the way we see the world. Because, for me, I'm Polish, but Podlasie also feels somehow Oriental. I guess it's because it's so far from where I live. It's less populated, there's more nature there. It has a different history, and it's to the east, and historically many invasions into Poland came from the east. So, there is this feeling among Poles, I think, that we would expect something bad to come from that direction. And it was even the case with the invasion of the Mongols, the ancestors of the Tatars. But of course, this is clearly a simplified way of thinking. And academically, I would say it reminds me of the concept of nesting Orientalism by the Balkan scholar Milica Bakic-Hayden. And she argued that generally everyone tends to orientalize something that lies more to the east or the south. So for example, here in Central Eastern Europe or Eastern Europe, we might ourselves be orientalized by the west of Europe, I guess seen as a bit more exotic, wild. There are some stereotypes. But we also orientalize what lies farther east. In that case, even within our own country, like Podlasie. But on the other hand, the thought I had after we went there, and it wasn't my first time in Podlasie, but first time discovering the Tatar culture and other cultures in that place. Well, like in the end, the whole region of Podlasie actually plays into this image of being a bit oriental, and it plays to its advantage, right? So it's marketed for tourism as this land of wild, ancient forests, and that it's this place full of exoticism, of religious and national minorities, or memories of those minorities. So, like in the end, the whole, they do economically rely on tourism, and tourism is focused around that folklore and around that exoticism. And you even mentioned that yourself when we just got there, I think.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I was actually very disappointed when we just arrived there. I remember saying that it's like we ran into a tourist trap or something. But then afterwards, that quickly changed, I find. There's also another thing. Talking to so many, so different members of the Tatar community, it gave me once more another look on what it means to be a minority community. And, I guess I belong to the majority in my society. And it gave me a sense, or perhaps I should say it gave me the privilege to look at my own society as a single community wherein people could identify in any way they want. But that's, of course, easier said than done. I mean, there's plenty of communities who want to identify as a minority and celebrate and exercise that difference, just as there are communities who feel treated as minorities because of discrimination or oppression, or by being denied access to the rights or privileges of the majority. And these Muslim Tatars, I felt, they are kind of caught in between. So on the one hand, many have a strong urge to accentuate, to emphasize their Tatar as well as the Muslim identity. So culture as well as religion, because they're clearly afraid that that's disappearing. And on the other hand, the attacks of 2001, so the 9/11 attacks in America, they've made them an object of what I call the radicalization discussion. And for some, they became the token Muslims who were integrated and peaceful, the good Muslims. And to others, they were seen as the bad Muslims. They were the danger in the bosom of Polish society. And either way, they were made the object of European talk about Islam. Just like the other Muslims in Europe, there's a lot of talk about Muslims, very little with Muslims. And in the case of Muslims in Western Europe, one could perhaps understand this kind of talk because of the fact that Muslims are a relatively new phenomenon. But I found it shocking that the same way of talking is happening in Poland to a segment of the population that has been living there for so many centuries and that has lived and bled for that society. And I always had an optimism that with the passing of generations that we will achieve a kind of a natural integration of societies. But this was one of the moments that I realized that it is not a natural process. This integration is a process that needs commitment from the side of the majority, not the minority.
Yeah, I agree. And I think here you're also touching on something that has been bothering me ever since we went to Podlasie. What does it actually mean to belong to a nation? And also at the same time, why do we treat it as such an unquestionable truth? One that allows us to segregate people into those who are deemed worthy of being part of a society and those considered unworthy, considered even dangerous, or maybe someone who's not welcome and should be thrown out in some way. And I at some level, I understand why we think that way. We've been socialized to think that way. But on the other, nation states are a relatively recent phenomenon. Secular nations were born during the Enlightenment. So it's not so easy, and it hasn't been so long. Like, it's the history of nation states is shorter than history of Tatars in Poland, basically. But today, we do build walls on our borders everywhere, and this is also a case in Podlasie. And we build them literally to keep out people, and especially people we assume to be Muslim, and therefore we assume they might be dangerous, or we listen to the narrative by our politicians or whomever else that these people are dangerous and we need to stop them for our own safety. And then we tell minorities like these Tatars, who have been present for 600 or 700 years, that this time is still not enough. It's like they still have to prove that they're worthy and that they are not dangerous and that they can be part of the society. Partly because something has happened in another continent on 9/11 more than 20 years ago, but partly also because Islam still is considered this dangerous other in Europe. So somehow Tatars become suspects, and it seems that they need to constantly prove their allegiance to their adopted country simply because of their religion, simply because they're religious and also ethnic, cultural minority. But religion in this case plays, I guess, the most important role. But I think here also it's very important for me to go back to this region and Podlasie itself, because exactly this issue of nation states and borders and Islamophobia is for me more visible there than anywhere else. And we do have Tatar minority living there for centuries. We had have other minorities living there, but it's also the same place where today migrants and refugees are still dying in the forests as a result of these very policies. And I did mention that in our podcast when we were there, because we did visit a cemetery. But, it hasn't changed, and this crisis is still ongoing. And it's not only here, it's actually all over the world. But here it connects to Tatars themselves as well. And then I guess for those 2 years, I've been all the time also thinking about this concept and this idea of adopted homeland, which basically started us somehow on this journey. At least we've seen this concept in the beginning of our trip, and it stayed with us.
It was written on the statue, I remember. Yeah, in Gdansk.
Yeah, and it bothered me then, and it still bothers me. But I think now I finally slowly start to understand what Tatars might mean by adopted homeland. And it's not that they are not part of Poland somehow, but it's actually this idea of being indigenous to somewhere, and that there is the specific relationship with the land you come from, so actually to the land itself, and that this relationship is worth celebrating. So I think now I understand it, and I'm not sure if it's right or wrong, but that while Tatars are part of the Polish nation and are part of Polish society, they also nurture their origins by preserving collective memory, culture, and also religion. But it might be about something else than nation, actually.
Yeah. It's interesting you're saying that. Yeah. I had to think about it. My thoughts were wandering in another direction in the past year, 2 years. I was very much thinking about what Islam is, or religion in general, what we mean by that. Because the way we talk about it today is very much in terms of of doctrine. I mean, that religion is understood as the sum of all its rules and principles, right? I mean, that when we talk about a religion, or when we ask about someone's religion, it's either about religious practices and rituals or about the doctrines and the rules of that religion. Right? And that's also the way that most believers talk about it, just like we see that with Muslim communities elsewhere in Europe. But with the Muslim Tatars, it goes further. It goes to the origins. And that's actually, that's what you just said, isn't it? It goes to the origins of themselves, but also of what it means to be a Muslim. Issues that are so clear to Muslims elsewhere in Europe or in the Middle East for that matter. Like, what makes you a Muslim? Or what are the basic practices that come with being a Muslim? Such questions, that's not so self-evident to the Muslim Tatar. They're posing different questions, like, are you a Muslim because you're a Tatar? And do you lose being a Tatar once you take on another religion? And what is a more authentic Islam? Is it the doctrines that are taught from scripture today? Or the practices that have been preserved for more than 6, 7, or 8 centuries? And to me, I find that this gives a new perspective on what we mean by religion.
But, I think it actually ties back or goes back to what you said in the beginning, of our conversation now, that it is about celebrating being a minority and the role of religion when it comes to that. So for me, one thing is a belief and religion you grow up with, but there, like what you're saying about rituals and practices is also very important. Religion is also about tradition and culture and about being grounded in familiar rites, sounds, tastes. And, we all grow up or usually grow up with some kind of tradition like that, and we take it for granted. And often until we go abroad or encounter someone with different customs, different traditions, we don't really, we don't think about what we find natural and I hate the word normal, but I'm gonna use it. What we find normal, and I think there's a lot of beauty in preserving those traditions and then also recognizing them by encountering others. But I also think it's very hard to, keep those traditions and rituals and practices flourishing when you are a minority in a society that tends to push for conformity, and especially secular conformity. And if not, then within, for example, in Poland, it is the dominant Christian tradition. And it's not really about belief, but it's a lot of that is about practice and tradition and how, we assume the life in public should be. And then when I think about Tatars, for example, I think I also consider it to be, like preserving the tradition and rituals and the belief. And it's also in this form, which is specific for the Tatars here, that is not practiced elsewhere in the world, that this is even some kind of an act of bravery, because, it makes them visible in a way, while just because they're Muslim, they are part of a group that's been being vilified in public discourse for at least 2 decades. And especially in last years, it also was worse. But at the same time, these religious traditions, they're personal, but if they're presented to the world, and Tatars do that. Tatars share their culture through festivals, through restaurants, through other spaces, for example, in Podlasie. And actually that helps to build a more diverse society. And, give back this information or experience or memories or traces of complicated histories and different ways of being in the world. And I guess after our trip and after working on this podcast and doing other stuff academically at the same time that somehow relates to that, I think I really wish we had more conversations in Europe in general about what a democracy of difference could look like. Under, a society that doesn't just put up with diversity, just doesn't just tolerate diversity, but actually sees it as something valuable and essential in public life. And I think also natural, because, Europe used to be diverse. It was always diverse. And it's very artificial to try to make it less so.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess that the main conclusion we can have now at the end of the podcast is that we just got started. I mean, this podcast was a meeting with the Tatar Muslims, an introduction to their lives and history. And perhaps, but I'm talking as an academic now, perhaps the questions that this trip has raised are more important than the knowledge that we have now about this particular community. To me, this trip was not only about Tatars in Poland. It really made me think about what it means to be a European, how we structure our societies, and what the role of religion and history is in all that.
Mm-hmm. And I think we could start another podcast just about that, which also sounds good. I think making another podcast would be lots of fun. So let's maybe think about it. Yeah. No, I look forward to it. I mean, it was great to work together. So let's continue doing so. Yep. So I'm looking forward to our next trip then. And I hope this podcast, will bring something to us and our listeners.
I hope so too. I think it will. Okay. Bye, Eva.
Bye, Maurits. See you soon. Let's be in touch. Bye. This podcast was hosted by Maurits Berger and Ewa Górska. Sound editing by Tomasz Stankiewicz, tostanki.pl. Voiceover Natalia Orkisz-Plebanek and Zbigniew Lecznar. Music in this podcast series is by Ansambl Peregrinus, which recreated traditional Tatar music, and by the Arab artists Sabri Mosbah, Tamer Nafar, Ghalia and Youssef Kehia.